I saved a man's life. And in return, all I gained was another shadow of loneliness to keep me company. If you heard someone speak those words, wouldn't you wonder? A cowboy who chose silence over society, who one day found himself saving an old Apache elder out in a dry gulch. What kind of turn would his life take after that? Was the reward for his kindness a new beginning, or just another burden in disguise? Before we step into this story, if you find yourself drawn to these western journeys, harsh lands, red dust, and the way a single choice can bend the whole course of a man's life, then make sure you follow this channel. Every comment you leave is a small spark that helps me keep telling these tales the wind and years tried to bury. Out past Dry Creek, spring lay quiet that year. Night still held the bite of frost, the wind off the red hills cutting sharp across old fence lines. Colt Brandon, 34, was a man who had grown so used to silence that it had become his only true companion. Folks said he once rode as a scout in the final years of the war, but that chapter had left him hollow. A brother lost in crossfire, youth wasted on blood and vengeance, and when the smoke cleared, Colt walked away. He traded meaning for monotony, battle for barbed wire men's voices for the creak of wood posts in dry earth. His ranch wasn't much, just a few hundred acres of hard-baked soil, enough to graze cattle if you rationed every drop of water. Corn wouldn't take, barley wouldn't last. But Colt didn't ask for much. He liked things modest, no debts, no crowds, no knocking at the door. It was in that familiar quiet that a sound broke through. Not cattle, not wind, not the buzz of flies. Something raw, ragged, human. Colt froze, one hand instinctively brushing the Winchester at his side. The old knot in his stomach tightened, the same one he used to feel before a gunfight. The gulch lay only a couple miles off, but the ride stretched long. Dust kicked into his face, the gelding's hooves clattering on loose stone. Then he saw it, the bear. Gray hide stretched over ribs, hunger wild in its eyes, claws tearing at a body sprawled on the ground. Colt didn't hesitate. One shot to the shoulder, another to the neck, a third between the eyes. The echoes rang and faded, leaving the gulch stripped of sound. Colt moved closer, rifle still raised, and looked down at the man the bear had nearly finished. He was older hair streaked with gray skin, weathered deep by sun and years. Apache beads hung from his shirt, though he wore no paint, no weapons. Blood soaked into the dust beneath him, and his breath came thin, almost gone. Colt crouched low, pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck. Alive. Barely. Those eyes opened, clouded, but steady. They met Colt's without fear. For a long second, Colt just stared back. Then he exhaled. "All right," he muttered. "Let's get you out of here." The ride back was slow. The man's weight slumped against him, blood seeping into Colt's shirt. The cabin was small, 1 bed, 1 chair, 1 fire. But it was enough. Colt stitched, cleaned, bound the wounds. He worked in silence, the same way he fixed fences or sharpened tools, steady, exact, with no thought of thanks. 3 days passed. No words, only shallow breaths and the crackle of fire. Colt checked the bandages, spooned broth between cracked lips, dabbed sweat from a fevered brow. The man's eyes tracked him, always sharp and measuring. But he never spoke. On the 4th morning, Colt found the cot empty. Panic bit quick. Then he saw him, the elder, sitting cross-legged by the fire, frail but upright. "You never asked who I was," the man said in a voice like gravel. Colt shrugged. "Figured you'd tell me, if it mattered." The old man nodded once. "It does. My name is Toka. My people live 10 ridges east." He paused, meeting Colt's eyes. "You saved my life. That is seen." Colt didn't answer. To him it was just what a man ought to do. But Toka studied him long, as if weighing something heavier than gratitude. The next dawn, Toka was gone. No footprints, no sign of struggle. Just emptiness heavier than before. Colt stood on the porch a long while, staring toward the jagged ridgelines, feeling the weight of silence press in harder than it had in years. Days later, when routine had begun to fill the void again, a new shadow entered his life. A young woman sat by the cold fire, silent, waiting. Skin bronzed by sun hair, long and dark dress torn from hard miles. Sana, she called herself. Toka's granddaughter. She had not come for shelter. She had been sent offered as a gift of honor, but exiled in truth. Cast out, delivered to him like a token of thanks. Colt looked at her, and knew saving Toka had ended his solitude. But it had not given him companionship. It had left him with another soul, adrift another weight of loneliness set beside his own. And out there, in the hush of the New Mexico frontier, two exiles, one by choice, one by force, began a story neither of them had asked for, yet neither could turn away from. You saved him, and now I am here. But are you sure you want to accept what comes with that? The words cut through the small cabin like a blade, slicing into the silence Colt Brandon had kept for years. A man who had chosen solitude now stood face to face with a stranger, and in that instant he knew the quiet would never again be his alone. Sana appeared on a gray morning when the sky still carried the chill of night, and the sun's first light had no strength against the cold. She sat near the dead hearth, clutching a worn leather satchel, her eyes wide but not afraid. Colt saw exhaustion written all over her hair, tangled and dusty, a torn deerskin dress clinging to bruised skin, bare feet cracked and calloused from miles of walking. For a heartbeat, Colt thought she looked like a ghost. His hand lingered near the rifle on the wall, his body stiff against the doorframe. He didn't ask who she was right away. She didn't explain. They simply stared at each other, the silence thick enough to feel. Finally, Colt broke it. You lost no. Her voice was hoarse but steady. Then why here? She didn't answer. Her grip only tightened on the satchel. Suspicion rose in him like an old habit. Years as a scout had taught him to distrust shadows, tracks in the dirt, even eyes too quiet to read. And this woman, this stranger, was nothing but questions wrapped in silence. She ate her first meal at the cabin without a word. Colt set bread, eggs, and dried meat in front of her. She ate slow, careful, not wasting a crumb, as if each bite carried more weight than just hunger. Colt sat across the room watching, suspicious, curious. When the plates were empty, she finally spoke. My name is Sana. Toka was my grandfather. He said, you saved his life. Colt froze. So that was the tie. The old Apache he had carried out of the gulch, stitched and watched over this, was his answer. He sent me here, she continued. My people say a life saved must be honored. I am the honor. Colt stood, the words striking him cold. No, he said sharply. I didn't do it for this. You don't belong to me. Silence fell again. Sana didn't protest. She bowed her head, fingers trembling against the ragged hem of her dress. It wasn't fear. It was something heavier, older, like a wound, reopened, too familiar to sting. Colt turned away, stepping outside to breathe the cold air. His thoughts tangled like barbed wire. Why had Toka done this? Was it truly tradition, or just a way to discard a woman who no longer had a place? And why send her to him, a stranger with nothing but fences and silence? That night, Sana curled on the floor by the fire under a rough wool blanket he tossed her. Colt lay awake on the cot, listening to her restless shifting, the sound of someone searching for a place to fit. By morning, she was seated at the window, eyes on the wide, wind-scoured land. She spoke no request to stay, no thanks. Just her presence, heavy as stone. And that weighed on Colt more than words could. The days that followed brought no answers. Sana mended his torn shirt without asking, swept ashes from the hearth, and watched him from the porch with eyes too steady, too solemn. Every small act forced the same question into Colt's mind. Was she here to belong or simply to survive? Colt had built his life on certainty. A fence held cattle. A bullet found its mark. A dawn always came after dark. But nothing about Sana was certain. She wasn't a guest, wasn't a wife, wasn't a prisoner. She was something in between, an exile, a mystery laid at his door. And her presence, instead of filling the emptiness, carved it deeper. It left Colt wrestling with doubt, not just about her, but about himself, and about the strange reward fate had left sitting at his fire. They say loneliness is cold, but sometimes just having someone sit quietly beside you is enough to make the fire burn warmer. That thought passed through Colt's mind one spring morning as sunlight cut through the narrow cracks of his cabin and fell across the young woman bent over a torn shirt. Sana's hands moved in steady stitches, her face calm, her silence unbroken. She asked nothing, explained nothing. And yet from the moment she stepped inside the cabin, no longer felt the same. Colt kept his distance at first. He rose before dawn, fed the horses stretched wire-hauled water. At night he ate quickly washed and slept in silence. But now every step he took seemed shadowed by another sound, the scrape of a broom against the floor, the faint rustle of cloth folded away, the soft clink of a pot set on the stove. Sana didn't wait for permission. She mended clothes, swept out the corners, fetched water without being asked. Her hands bore calluses, her wrists faint scars, but she moved with a quiet certainty, the kind born of someone who had survived too many winters. Colt watched her warily. He worried she might upset the order of his life, the hard rhythm he had carved out of solitude. He told himself she was only passing through that one morning. She would vanish like her grandfather. But as the days wore on, he began to notice her silence wasn't the same as his. His was armor. Hers was acceptance. She wasn't hiding. She was simply present. One afternoon, Colt was driving fence posts when Sana appeared carrying a heavy bucket of water. Her hands trembled, but her stride didn't falter. "Leave it," Colt called. She shook her head and set it down beside him. Then she crouched, caught hold of the wire, and braced it steady while he drove the hammer down. He started to object, but the look in her eyes, calm, firm, held him still. They worked like that until the sun tilted west, sweat running down both faces, dirt streaked across skin. Not one wasted word. Yet the fence that stood at the end of the day felt stronger than any Colt had built alone. That night she sat by the fire, stitching her head bent to the glow. He sat across the room knife, scraping against the whetstone. The soft rasp of stone and the slip of thread through cloth blended into a kind of rhythm, a quiet duet. Colt's eyes wandered toward her, and once when she caught the weight of his gaze, her lips curved just slightly. Half a smile not offered, not explained. A storm rolled in one evening. The shutters rattled, the wind howled like wolves across the plain. Sana pulled her knees close, staring into the fire. Colt laid another log on the flames, then sat nearby. They said nothing, letting the storm rage outside. Then, barely above a whisper, Sana began to hum. No words, just a trembling melody, thin but steady weaving into the roar of the wind. Colt froze. He had not heard song in that cabin for years. Her voice wasn't strong, wasn't meant for anyone's ears but her own, and still it changed the room. It turned the silence from emptiness into something shared. Colt didn't thank her, didn't speak, he only listened. But something shifted deep in him. Silence no longer felt like a burden. It became a thread, delicate but binding, stretched between them. Days later, Colt came back from checking stock to find a small wooden chair set out on the porch. Sana sat there watching the horizon bleed into red. When he stepped up, she tilted her head in a simple nod. He lowered himself beside her. Their shoulders didn't touch, but their eyes followed the same distant line of hills. Nothing needed saying. The act of sitting side by side was enough. And in that moment, Colt understood some things don't need words. A nod, a shared task. A melody hummed against the wind. These were the small ways two strangers, both carved hollow by solitude, began to find themselves less alone. There are wounds you can't see with your eyes, but once spoken aloud, they begin to close. Colt wasn't a man of stories. His life had been measured by the clang of a hammer on fence posts, the whistle of wind across dry pasture, the silence of a cabin built for one. But since Sana's arrival, nights had begun to feel different. When the firelight flickered against the walls, he sometimes caught her eyes reflecting the glow. Dark, steady, but heavy with something unsaid. That night the world outside was black, and the wind rattled hard across the roof. Inside only the fire crackled. Colt sat with his knife and whetstone, the slow scrape filling the room. Sana sat a few feet away, her hands clasped tight, her gaze fixed on the flames. The silence stretched until her voice broke it, hoarse but clear. When I was a girl, they took me, bound my hands with rope, dragged me along their wagons. I walked 4 days' feet, bleeding, throat burning. Colt's hand stilled. The scrape of steel against stone cut off. He lifted his eyes to her, but she kept hers on the fire, as if speaking only to it. They laughed when I fell, tossed me scraps of food. At a northern fort they tried to trade me for whiskey. The officer refused, said I was too bruised to be worth anything. Her words faltered thin as smoke. Colt's jaw tightened. His chest burned with a fury he couldn't voice. She went on. My tribe found me, brought me back, gave me food, a place to sleep. But her breath hitched. They no longer saw me the same. They said my body had been tainted. They didn't want me at the fire anymore. The last words landed heavy. Colt leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes steady on her. Listen, he said, voice low but firm. You're not a debt. You're not a trade. No one decides your worth but you. For the first time, Sana turned her face toward him. Her dark eyes shone in the firelight, and he saw it just a crack, a fissure in the mask she'd carried too long. You're a person here, he added, slower, surer. Nothing more, nothing less. Her lips trembled. She lowered her gaze fingers, smoothing the edge of the blanket, as if reclaiming warmth from a world that had denied her too often. The next day, the air between them shifted. Colt went out to the corral, but when he saw her walking with a bucket of water, he didn't stop her. She moved with quiet certainty, pouring water into the troughs. He watched, realizing her hands weren't just willing, they were practiced, carrying the memory of long years of labor. Later, while Colt checked a horse's old wound, Sana crouched beside him. Her palm steadied the animal's leg. This stitch isn't holding, she murmured. It'll need new bandaging. Colt blinked. You know that my mother was a healer. She taught me herbs, how to sew wounds, how to keep them clean. Her voice softened. She's gone now. No one wanted to hear those things after she died. But I remember. Colt said nothing, but he handed her the needle and thread. Together they worked his hands, steadying the flank hers, guiding the stitch with care. Each pull of the thread felt like binding more than flesh, as if it was closing gaps carved deep in both their lives. That evening, as the sun painted the red hills gold, they sat on the porch. The air smelled of dust and dry grass. Sana hugged her knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. Colt sat beside her silent, but the silence felt different now. Not a void, but a recognition both carried scars, and neither had to hide them anymore. After a while, Colt spoke almost in a whisper. People can laugh, they can turn their backs, but they can't strip your worth. I see it. Her head turned. You truly believe that? He nodded once. I've no reason to lie. Silence again, but softer this time. Then her lips curved barely, but enough. A small fragile smile, not meant to please him, not borrowed from habit. It was hers, honest and real. That night by the fire, they didn't speak further. But Colt knew something had shifted. Their silence was no longer just shared. It was healing. A beginning, fragile but real, born in a cabin where a man once thought he'd spend a lifetime alone. Sometimes love doesn't begin with promises, but with the brush of a hand just enough to know you're no longer alone. That thought stirred in Colt one quiet afternoon when Sana's fingers grazed his across the rough wooden table. There was no lightning, no blaze of fire, only a warmth that spread from his hand to his chest, steady and unexpected. And in that warmth, he realized the silence between them had begun to find its own rhythm. In the days that followed, the cabin changed in small but certain ways. Supper was no longer a single plate set out for one. It was 2 bowls, 2 spoons, 2 sets of hands passing bread back and forth. The faint clatter of tin against tin filled the space that had once held only wind and fire. Sana often sat across from him. her eyes sometimes downcast, sometimes lifting just long enough to meet his. They didn't need much talk. The way she offered him beans, the way he pushed the last piece of bread her way, those simple exchanges spoke louder than words. One morning, Colt stepped outside to find an old shirt, once frayed and near useless, hanging neat on the line. Sana had stitched it back together, the seams tight and even. At the hem, she'd tied a small knot in blue thread, a mark no one had asked for, a mark all her own. Colt slipped the shirt on and felt for the first time that what he carried on his shoulders wasn't only his burden anymore. That evening, returning dusty from the fence line, he saw her by the window, dark hair spilling over her shoulder as she bundled drying herbs. He stopped in the doorway, watching. The sight was ordinary and strange all at once, strange only because it looked like home, a picture he had never thought to find inside his cabin. Another time when he led the horses back, Sana stepped close, resting her hand against the neck of his bay. The animal, restless a moment before, stilled under her touch. Colt glanced at her, and her eyes met his, not only calm for the horse, but carrying a quiet trust meant for him as well. His chest tightened, words failing. That night by the fire, she let her hair fall loose, then slowly braided it into 2 thick plaits. Colt watched her hands, careful and patient, weaving, as if binding 2 lives together, strand by strand. When she lifted her head, her gaze held his. For once, Colt didn't look away. In the glow of fire, her eyes spoke without demand, without plea. "I am here. With you." One windy night, after checking the latch on the door, Sana asked softly, "Will I always be apart here, just a shadow in your house?" The question cut him still. He turned, saw her face half lit, carrying both fear and hope. He stepped forward, pressed a second blanket into her hands, and said low, "You don't have to be a shadow. Just be yourself. Just stay." That night, Colt lay down beside her for the first time. There was no rush, no claim, only the steady beat of 2 hearts, the warmth of breath between them. Sana shifted, letting her hand rest lightly over his. He didn't move it away. He let the warmth spread a quiet admission that they had crossed a boundary neither of them had dared before. From then on, the long days felt lighter. Out on the range, Sana often walked beside him sometimes, only to hand him water, sometimes just to sit and watch while he worked. They didn't fill the hours with chatter. A nod, a fleeting smile, the brush of hands on the same tool handle. Each was enough to make the day feel whole. Colt came to understand love didn't need grand gestures or words spoken loud. It lived in small things, the mended shirt, the shared meal, the fire-lit glance. And through those small things, something had rooted itself between them, quiet, certain, and steadily warming, like embers gathering into flame. People can be traded, abandoned, but only you can choose where you belong. That truth echoed in Colt's mind one windless evening, when Sana lifted her eyes from the fire and whispered, "I want a new name. One that belongs to me, not one given by others." In that moment, Colt understood what lay between them was no longer just the warmth of chance closeness. It had become something deeper, choice. Sana had been in the cabin for weeks now, long enough for her footprints to mark the fence line, long enough for Colt's shirt, mended with blue thread, to become his daily wear, long enough that the fire never died cold in the mornings. And yet, he sometimes caught in her gaze a flicker of sadness, as if part of her still hovered on the edge. That night over a simple meal, she set her spoon down, hands trembling. "I want another name," she said, eyes fixed on the table. Colt frowned, waiting, but she went on. "The name Sana reminds me of everything I lost. It tells me I was unwanted, passed on. I want a name I can choose, or one chosen for me." Colt sat silent, the weight of her words heavy. He wasn't a man skilled with language, but something inside him swelled with respect. Slowly he set down the knife in his hand and met her gaze. "You've done what few could, you stayed. Cast off unwanted, yet still standing. Then your name ought to mean that. Stay." Her eyes widened, startled. He leaned closer, his voice steady. "Stay." Because when no one else would, you did. Sana reached out her fingers, trembling as they touched his. I'll keep it, she whispered, and for the first time he saw tears gather not from sorrow, but from something deeper, rawer recognition. The days after carried a new weight of certainty. She no longer hovered at the edges of his work, but moved beside him, holding wire taut as he hammered hauling wood for the corral, kneeling in the dust at his side. Colt realized her presence no longer unsettled him. It had become fact, as steady as the rising sun or the cricket song at dusk. One evening, with the red hills glowing under the setting sun, Sana asked softly, "If I chose to stay forever, what would I be to you?" Colt's hand stilled. He looked at her weathered palms scarred by years of labor, then answered in a voice low but sure, "You wouldn't be a guest, not a debt, not someone sent. You'd be my wife." Sana's breath caught. She didn't turn away. Slowly she nodded. "I want that, but only if it's mine to choose." Colt reached out his rough hand, brushing her cheek. "Then choose." Her reply came steady, certain I already have. This time when their lips met, it was no tentative brush. It was a kiss of claim, of confirmation. All the silence, all the scars, all the nights of holding back, led here to the moment they chose one another openly, without shame. From that night, the proof was everywhere. Sana tied her hair with new leather strips Colt had cut. He woke each morning with her beside him, no longer curled alone on the floor. Her cotton dress hung on the same peg as his shirts, her boots by the door next to his. The cabin, once empty, now held evidence of two lives woven into one. One evening, Colt carved a simple ring from bone. No jewels, no shine, just smooth warm, shaped by his hands. He offered it without speeches. Sana slid it onto her finger, smiled faintly, and said, "I wear it because I want to, not because I must." Colt nodded once, but inside he knew it was the last confirmation he needed. Their love had not been built on vows or paper, not on ceremonies or words shouted aloud. It was born in a new name, in a free choice, in the quiet certainty that in a world quick to cast them aside, they had chosen each other. They say a home is not built of wood and stone alone, but of two hands working together, and of two hearts willing to stay for one another. From the day those three riders disappeared over the ridge, Colt and Sana's life entered a new season. The question of whether she was allowed to remain was gone. The answer was clear: they had chosen each other, and no one else had the right to take that away. The small cabin at Dry Creek slowly became a true home. Each morning, Colt still rose before dawn, tugged on his old boots, and shrugged into the shirt patched with blue thread. But now, when he opened the door, he no longer saw an empty porch. He saw Sana's shoes resting neatly beside his. Inside, the sound of her steps, the crackle of the fire, the scent of fresh bread, it all reminded him that the cabin was no longer a place for one man's survival, but for two lives joined. Sana began planting the seeds she carried in her small pouch. To her, they weren't just beans or squash, they were promises. Each time her fingers pressed them into the dry soil, Colt saw the light of belief in her eyes. This land could give life, just as their love had. She spoke of her mother, a healer who taught her the wisdom of plants, the sage that cooled fevers, the resin that sealed wounds. Colt listened sometimes with only a nod, but inside he knew this house, this ground, was being reborn through her memory and her will to nurture. In the evenings they sat together, sharing more than food. Colt spoke of his brother lost in war, of nights haunted by fire and smoke. Sana listened without pressing, only resting her warm hand on his. When his words faltered, she said quietly, "We've both lost pieces of ourselves, but that's why we understand the worth of having each other." Then one morning, while the light was still soft, Sana took his hand and placed it gently on her belly. For a heartbeat, Colt froze, breath locked in his chest. Her eyes met his steady, certain. "I'm carrying a child," she whispered. No words came to him. He simply pulled her into his arms and held her tighter than he had ever held anyone. In that embrace, Colt understood their cabin was no longer for two alone. A third life was coming, a life born of choice, not dead of love, not exile. From then on, every task carried a new meaning. When Colt repaired the fence, he thought, "This isn't just for the cattle. It's for my family." When Sana folded blankets, she thought, "Our child will sleep in this warmth." Each seed pressed into the earth, each beam set into place, became part of the foundation for a future greater than either had dared imagine. And for us, dear listener, what do we see in this? A cowboy who once believed his life would end in solitude now, with a woman who chose to stay a home that shelters more than silence, and a child waiting to be born. Sana, once treated as a debt to be cast away, now carries a promise of new life proof that no one can define her worth but herself. If you followed their journey from suspicion to quiet trust to love freely chosen, then this is the moment to lend them your support. Because their story isn't just about Colt and Sana. It is about anyone who has ever been pushed aside, yet found belonging, hope, and love. What do you think can Colt learn to be a father after so many years as a lone cowboy? Will Sana raise their child with enough love to erase the shadows of her past? Share your thoughts below. Your voice might just help shape the road that lies ahead. As for me closing this chapter, I see only this: out at Dry Creek among dust and wind, a true home has taken root. Not built of lumber or stone, but of choice, endurance, and love. And within that home, a child will soon cry out into the world, a promise that Colt and Sana's future will no longer be about mere survival, but about life, whole, enduring, forever.